So this here is the first card that we're going to work on. And the very first step is to stamp and color our images. So I have two pieces of cardstock here that are 3 3/4 by, 5 1/4 inches. One of them is going to be for the slider part inside, so I'm going to set that aside, and then I'm going to use one of them for my image. Now there is some stamping on the inside, but I'm going to suggest waiting until the card is put together to do that, just because it only raises a little bit for this exact design, and because it's not embossed or anything, there's nothing that needs to be done with it other than stamping, so that can wait till later. So I'm going to color this with alcohol ink markers. So I'm using a black Memento pad to stamp with. If you are using something else to color it, you can stamp with something else. Stays on, just a dye ink pad, you could still stamp with this for other coloring as well. But for alcohol ink markers, you definitely don't want to be using Stays On. My favorite thing to stamp with for them, for using them, is the Memento ink, because it's not going to react with the alcohol ink markers. So the stamp set that I'm using is this Mini Bird Crazy and Things. It has a lot of different accessories to go with it, which is one of the reasons why I love it. And it's also perfectly sized for cards. So I'm just stamping my images quickly. Typically I like to let them sit for a few minutes just to let the ink completely dry. And I'm just going to put my stamps up here to clean off later. This one here has some balloons that we are going to use, and I'm going to stamp them on a scrap piece of paper, and then they're going to be cut out once they are all completely dry. Put a little birthday hat on this guy here. Now, I didn't bother masking off the top of his head. I find that once it's colored, you really don't see that detail too much anyways. If you wanted, if that bothered you, you could always create a mask with some copy paper and put some removable adhesive on it to remove that top of his head. All right, last step, I'm going to put the sentiment, and the sentiment is from this one here, which is a coordinating set that goes with it. But the sentiments themselves I often use with other cards as well. I just like the sentiments that are on there. But this particular one is perfect with the bird stamps. A little birdie told me. I'm just going to grab some scrap paper for those balloons. Because I'm cutting them out, it doesn't need to be anything special, and I often keep these scrap pieces of paper when I cut things out just to use for this particular reason, or to stamp and use for sentiments. There we go. This set has a little there's a little balloon string on it as well, but because these are being hand cut, that's going to be awfully hard to hand cut, so I'm going to use just some cord to put strings on the balloons. Put that stamp set aside, put the lid on that there. So I'm going to start coloring this one here, just because this has been sitting for a few minutes longer. I have 2 different shades of pink. If you haven't used alcohol ink markers, they are my favorite way of coloring. And the simplest way to color with them is to use 2 shades of each color. You're going to color the image first lightly with the lighter of the 2 shades, which is what I'm doing now. I'm not using a really heavy stroke. I don't need a lot of ink on there. I just want a nice kind of base layer. And clearly that's not very carefully colored at all. A nice thing with this particular stamp set is all of those little cross-hatch lines. That kind of tells you where the shading should go. And I use that as a guide for this. I also put a little bit under its beak. And then I'm going to go back to my light color. Use little circular motions where the light and the dark meet, where it allows. Obviously there's not enough room right by its eye there. And then I go over the whole thing with the light color. Now, even though right after you've colored, it might look a little bit blotchy. It does even out as it dries. And the nice thing about alcohol markers is you can go back, make the dark darker, make the shadows darker, is basically what I'm trying to say. And you can color over that image forever and that paper is not going to start to pill. If you use dye-based markers, that paper starts to pill fairly quickly. I'm going to do one of my balloons while I have these markers out here. And the colors that I'm using will be listed on your supply list, as well as the paper sizes and where to score to create the card. Now I did go outside of the line there. If I was using it like this, I would clean it up with a colorless blender. A colorless blender doesn't actually blend, it removes color, and it's good for fixing little mistakes like that. But because I am cutting it out, there is no need to do that. And I just realized I already did a little mistake there. So I I'm going to do those. I lost my train of thought. I'm going to do the dots on the polka dots on the hat yellow, but I just colored them blue. But the cool thing with alcohol ink markers is I can go back with that yellow marker and go over it, and that yellow will start to push away the blue, and you'll still see the yellow. So we'll show you that in just a minute. Let's get this balloon colored. So dye-based markers are definitely easier for beginners because it's a lot closer to what we all grew up with. But there's so many more possibilities for alcohol ink markers. So I've got my yellow here. I'm going to do the bright colored one. I'm just going to first put a little bit of color in there, kind of let it dry just a tiny little bit. While that is drying, I'm going to color my balloon here. And once you get comfortable with using two colors to do your shading and stuff like that, you can get a little bit more advanced and you can use 3 colors. But 2 colors is a great thing to do for a beginner. All right, let's go back and do this yellow here. There we go. Now before I do any more coloring, I want to put some glossy accents on these balloons, and what that's going to do is it's going to make it just shiny and glossy, balloon-like basically. But it does take a little while for that to dry, and by a while I want to say at least an hour, depending on how thick you make it. So I'm just putting it on now so that can start drying while we're coloring the rest. But once your images are colored and you've put your stickles and your glossy accents, because we are going to do some stickles as well, you don't want to touch it. You want to put it somewhere where it is not going to be within reach, because if you accidentally touch it, not necessarily the stickles you wouldn't really see where you touched, but the glossy accents, because it has a nice glossy surface. If you were to touch it and get your fingerprint in it when it's half dried, the only way to fix it is to add some more glossy accents and then to start the weighting again. So best to do it. And I just realized there's a little open spot right there and right there. If by chance you happen to get a little bubble in there, you can take a thumbtack or a pin and you can pop it. And that needs to be done while it is all still wet. Once it's dry, that won't work.